Both American poet Pat Schneider and Australian writer Kylie Tennant have in common the desire to use writing as a political act, as a way to change the world. They also have in common an encounter with cockroaches, but the different ways of approaching that got me thinking about poverty and class. Kylie Tennant was a social critic and advocate for the poor. She was born in 1912 into a middle-class family in Manly, New South Wales. Her interest in the suffering caused by poverty was initially aroused by childhood tours of Sydney's slum areas on the way to church with her family on a Sunday. Believing in the educative power of fiction to change people's minds at a time during the 1930s, when no one cared about substandard housing and filthy slums, she decided to investigate for herself. So that Kylie could experience what life was like in a slum area, she and her husband Roddy, a new teacher who had lived as a child in one of those inner city slum areas, and they moved from one place to another. Describing one place, she writes, "The house we lived in had 2 rooms downstairs and one above, where the bugs lived. I did not bother them after the day when I went up to poison them, and a mother bug gathered her young behind her and dared me furiously with waving antennae. I admired that bug and respected her, so I left her and the hundreds in the cracks, and we slept downstairs." And for ages I admired Kylie Tennant for not killing the bugs, which I have assumed were cockroaches, given Sydney's reputations for these tough creatures and the way they breed in dense living areas and warm spaces. But then I read Pat Schneider's experience with roaches, as she calls them. She didn't have the option to live downstairs. She and her mother and younger brother were living in the basement of a house when they were kicked out by the owner, who said they'd brought roaches into her home. Pat's mother, and Pat was born in 1934, Pat's mother then put the children into orphanages and took Pat out again about 12 months later. Home became 2 rooms on the 3rd floor of an apartment building. In one room was the kitchen area and Pat's bed, and in the other room her grandmother, in her 80s, and mother shared a bed. Her brother was only briefly with his family between foster homes. Pat writes, "The neighbourhood was small stores, a pawn shop, several taverns, and 1 or 2 other tenements. 2 streetcar lines ran in front of our building. The lock on the front door was broken. The stairs were filthy, smelling of urine and roach poison. 7 families used 1 bathroom, and nobody cleaned anything." Pat was so ashamed of her home that she wouldn't open the door beyond a crack the day a teacher came to offer her a book she had written, and to tell Pat that she too could be a writer. In her 40s, Pat went back to college to do a 3-year creative writing program. The first story she wrote was a fictionalized account of how she killed the roaches in her apartment. She writes, "The boy sees a roach crawl from the top of the table down under it. He gets a can of roach poison, goes down on his knees and looks up at the bottom of the tabletop. There are hundreds of roaches there, more than he has ever seen in his life. He begins to spray, and roaches fall to the floor. Some scramble to get away. Some of the females half drop their bodies, their long brown egg sacs, and struggle in their dying. The boy imagines himself to be Pharaoh. He is king of the Egyptians. He is as mighty as the Sphinx. He is killing the Hebrews who are trying to flee, trying to get back to the promised land." Pat goes on to write how she needed to imagine herself as a pharaoh in order to be able to bear the slaughter of all the roaches. After I'd read Pat's lived experience of roaches, I went from admiring Kylie Tennant's pacifist approach to reflecting on how she could afford to take up that position. She didn't have to live with the bugs. She was only visiting while she conducted research. And she and Roddy had 3 rooms for 2 people, so they could spare one for the bugs. Whereas Pat and her family were 4 people, sometimes 5, trying to live in only 2 rooms. So it seems to me that doing research about people living in poverty, even with the very, very best of intentions, is quite different to actually living in poverty. Which doesn't mean that I admire Kylie Tennant any the less. I still appreciate what she was trying to do. but she was coming from quite a different standpoint to that young boy, to that young girl, the fictionalized boy, who'd already lost a home because of roaches.